In the Ardennes Forest of December 1944, a six-man reconnaissance unit was about to report back to command. A routine scouting mission turned deadly when a German battalion with heavy artillery positions spotted Lieutenant James Holloway's men. James Holloway wasn't your typical engineering officer. For 2 years, he had been a hardened combat veteran, known for his tactical ingenuity and ability to improvise under extreme conditions. When German forces opened fire and pursued them through the frozen wilderness, they had no idea they were facing a commander who could weaponize the Arctic storm itself. Holloway's desperate gambit to strike back at the artillery positions would trigger a battle of wills against the methodical German Hauptmann Voss. What began as a simple reconnaissance patrol would become a desperate fight for survival against both enemy forces and nature's fury. The snow-covered battleground would never be the same after their improvised assault changed the course of a planned German offensive that would have killed thousands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant James Holloway's breath frosted in the frigid air as he lowered his binoculars, the cold metal biting into his gloved fingers. Before him, through a break in the dense pines of the Ardennes forest, lay the unmistakable silhouettes of German artillery, far more than intelligence had indicated. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, dusting the shoulders of the 6 men who comprised his reconnaissance unit. What should have been a routine scouting mission had just transformed into something far more dangerous. Sergeant William Hayes crawled forward on his elbows, his weathered face grim beneath his helmet. "How many?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the December wind whistling through the trees. "Too many," Holloway replied. "Heavy artillery, at least a dozen 88s. Looks like they're setting up for a major offensive." Hayes let out a low whistle. "Battalion strength at minimum. Somebody at HQ fucked up the intel." Holloway nodded, his mind racing. He'd seen enough death in his 2 years of war to recognize a kill zone when he saw one. 6 men against a battalion, those weren't odds, they were a death sentence. "Sir?" Private Luis Ortega's voice came from behind, urgent but controlled. The radio man had pressed himself against a snow-covered log, the oversized backpack radio, propped beside him. "I think we should report this immediately. If they're preparing an artillery barrage, they'll hammer our forward positions before they even know what hit them," Holloway finished. He turned to study his men. Hayes, the veteran with eyes that had seen too much. Ortega, the quick-witted radio operator whose heritage had earned him more than a few sideways glances back at camp, despite his invaluable German language skills. Corporal Danny Grayson, the young farm boy from Minnesota, who could shoot the wings off a fly but had yet to face real combat, and 2 others, Wilson and Carmichael, solid soldiers who followed orders without question. 6 men. His responsibility. The memory surfaced unbidden. 9 bodies laid out in the mud of Normandy. Men who had trusted him to lead them. Men who never made it home. "Lieutenant?" Hayes prompted, recognizing the distant look in Holloway's eyes. Holloway snapped back to the present. "Ortega, get command on the line. They need to know about this artillery position immediately." The radio man nodded, fingers already working the dials of his equipment. Holloway turned back to the valley below, calculating distances, possibilities, escape routes. "Holy shit," Grayson whispered suddenly, pointing to the eastern ridge. "There's more coming." Through his binoculars, Holloway spotted the convoy. Trucks and half-tracks moving through the trees carrying reinforcements. This wasn't just an artillery position. This was a forward operating base with enough firepower to punch a hole straight through Allied lines. "Sir?" Ortega called softly, his face tense. "I can't get through. There's interference on all channels." "Jammed?" Hayes asked. "No. It's not active jamming. Feels more like atmospheric interference. Storm's playing hell with radio waves." Holloway was about to respond when the crack of a rifle shot split the air. A fountain of snow erupted inches from Grayson's head. "We've been spotted," Hayes barked. The peaceful winter forest transformed in an instant. Machine gun fire ripped through the trees, sending splinters and ice crystals flying. The Germans had sentries posted far ahead of their main position, a precaution Holloway should have anticipated. "Fall back," he ordered, already pulling Grayson, who seemed frozen in place, to his feet. Move! The unit broke into desperate retreat, bullets whining past them. Hayes fired controlled bursts from his Thompson, covering their withdrawal as they crashed through the underbrush. Holloway's mind shifted into the cold mechanical clarity that combat always brought. Analyzing terrain, calculating angles, identifying cover. This way, he shouted, veering toward a narrow ravine to their right. The natural depression might shield them from direct fire long enough to gain distance. They half ran, half slid down the snow-covered embankment, boots slipping on hidden ice. Behind them, German voices shouted commands. The enemy was in pursuit. Keep moving, Holloway ordered. Stick to the trees. Ortega struggled with the weight of the radio, his face twisted in concentration as he simultaneously tried to find a clear frequency. Lieutenant, I think Wilson's words cut off abruptly as a single shot cracked through the forest. He pitched forward, a small, dark hole appearing in his helmet. His body crumpled to the snow without another sound. Wilson! Grayson started, toward the fallen soldier, but Hayes grabbed him roughly by the collar. He's gone, kid. Nothing we can do. Keep moving or you're next. Holloway felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. Another name to add to his list of the dead. But Hayes was right. Stopping meant death for all of them. Move, he ordered again, his voice harder now. Double time. They pushed deeper into the ravine, the sound of pursuit growing louder behind them. Carmichael took point, rifle at the ready, while Hayes covered their rear. Grayson's face had gone sheet white, reality finally catching up to him. Ortega, any luck with that radio? Holloway asked as they ducked behind a fallen tree trunk. Nothing solid, sir. Sweat beaded on Ortega's forehead despite the cold. I'm picking up fragments but can't establish contact. Something's wrong with the atmosphere today. Could be a storm front moving in. Hayes crawled up beside them, breathing hard. They're organizing a sweep. I count at least 2 platoons in pursuit, and they know these woods a hell of a lot better than we do. Holloway nodded grimly. We need to gain higher ground, find a defensible position. Sir, Hayes said, lowering his voice. We both know what this is. We're outnumbered 50-1. Our radio's shot, and that German commander down there isn't going to let us waltz away with intel on his artillery positions. We're walking into a no-win scenario. The words hung in the frozen air between them. Holloway knew Hayes was right, but surrender wasn't an option, not with what they'd seen. We complete the mission, Sergeant. Those guns need to be reported or thousands of our boys die when that barrage hits. A burst of machine gun fire spattered against the trees above them, sending ice and bark raining down. They're flanking us, Carmichael shouted. Up the ridge, Holloway ordered. Move. They scrambled up the steep snow-covered slope, boots slipping on hidden rocks and ice patches. Grayson tripped, nearly losing his rifle, but Hayes hauled him upright with a grunt. German voices echoed from both sides of the ravine now. Sir? Ortega called, breathing heavily under the weight of his pack. I think there might be a clear spot up ahead. If I can get to higher ground. A bullet whizzed past Holloway's ear, so close he felt the air displacement. He dropped instinctively, dragging Ortega down with him as gunfire erupted all around them. Carmichael returned fire, the bark of his M1 cutting through the crisp air. Go, Holloway shouted. I'll cover. He rolled to his stomach and sighted down his rifle, squeezing off controlled shots at the muzzle flashes below. The rest of the unit continued upward, scrabbling for handholds in the frozen earth. Adrenaline coursed through Holloway's veins, narrowing his vision to a series of targets and trajectories. 3 rounds left in the magazine. He made them count, then quickly reloaded. By. He reached the top of the ridge. Holloway found the others huddled behind a cluster of rocks. Hayes was checking his ammunition while Ortega frantically worked his radio dials. Grayson seemed paralyzed, his rifle clutched in white-knuckled hands. Carmichael? Holloway asked, noticing the missing man. Hayes shook his head once, his face grim. Took one in the throat as we came over the ridge, 2 men down, 4 left. The odds kept getting worse. Holloway peered over the rocks, assessing their position. They had reached a small plateau with decent cover and good sight lines down the ravine. But beyond the plateau rose a sheer cliff face, an impassable wall of ice-slick rock. They had run out of terrain. Ortega, that radio. Still trying, sir. I think. Wait, I'm getting something. Ortega pressed the headphones tighter against his ears. It's breaking up, but something about a weather front. Major storm system. His face fell. And then it's gone. The signal just died. Below them, methodical German voices coordinated their approach. Holloway could see them now. Gray uniforms moving through the trees, spreading out to surround the plateau. Professional. Disciplined. Led by someone who knew what they were doing. Looks like we're making our stand here, Hayes said matter-of-factly, checking the action on his Thompson. Holloway nodded, a strange calm settling over him. Tactical assessment. No retreat possible. Enemy forces converging from multiple vectors. Ammunition limited. No communication with command. Conclusion: they were trapped. Grayson, he said firmly, crouching beside the young soldier. I need you on that outcropping. Use your scope. Pick your shots. The farm boy stared at him with wide eyes, fear written plainly across his face. I can't, Grayson stammered, his hand shaking. Hayes was there in an instant, his weathered face inches from Grayson's. Listen to me, kid. Either you fight or you die, simple as that. Now get your ass on that rock and do your job. Something in Hayes's voice broke through. Grayson swallowed hard, then nodded, crawling toward the position Holloway had indicated. Sir? Ortega called suddenly, his voice tight with urgency. Look. Holloway followed his gaze to the western sky. Dark clouds were rolling in with unnatural speed, a wall of gray-black that swallowed the horizon. The wind had picked up too, carrying the first biting particles of ice. That's one hell of a storm front, Hayes muttered. As Holloway watched the approaching tempest, a thought began to form. Not hope, exactly, but possibility. Mother Nature was about to throw a new variable into this deadly equation. German voices grew louder. They were nearly surrounded now, the enemy closing in for the kill. Holloway took position behind a boulder, sighting down his rifle at the tree. Line below. Hold your fire until I give the word, he ordered. Make every shot count. The forest had gone eerily still. The Germans knew they had their quarry trapped. They could afford to be methodical now. The storm clouds swallowed the weak December sun, plunging the forest into premature twilight. The first heavy snowflakes began to fall, thick and fast, riding the strengthening wind. Holloway felt the cold biting deeper now, the temperature dropping precipitously as the Arctic air mass rolled in. In the strange half-light, he could just make out the silhouettes of German soldiers moving into position among the trees. Steady, he whispered. Beside him, Hayes gripped his Thompson with the casual confidence of a man who had faced death too many times to fear it anymore. Just like Bastogne all over again, he muttered. Not quite, Holloway replied. Bastogne had better weather. A ghost of a smile crossed Hayes's weathered face. And better odds. The wind howled across the plateau, the storm front hitting them with full force now. Visibility dropped as snow and ice particles filled the air. Through the white curtain, Holloway caught a glimpse of movement, a German soldier breaking cover, signaling to others. He squeezed the trigger. The report of his rifle was almost lost in the rising storm. The battle for survival had begun. The crack of Holloway's rifle echoed across the plateau, swallowed almost instantly by the howling wind. Through the swirling snow he saw the German soldier crumple, but there was no satisfaction in the sight, only the cold calculation that they'd just lost the element of surprise. Here they come, Hayes shouted as muzzle flashes lit up the tree line, bullets pinging off rocks and slicing through the air around them. Holloway ducked lower behind his boulder, snow building on his helmet and shoulders. The storm had descended with startling speed, transforming the forest into a howling white void. Wind-driven ice crystals stung any exposed skin, and the temperature was plummeting by the minute. Return fire, he ordered. Controlled bursts. Grayson's rifle cracked from the outcropping, followed by Hayes's Thompson chattering a response to the German guns. Ortega had wedged himself in his radio behind a fallen log, one hand still working the dials while the other gripped his sidearm. Through the thickening curtain of snow, Holloway could barely make out the German positions. This wasn't the calculated firefight he'd expected. It had devolved into chaos, with both sides firing blindly into the storm. "I can't see a damn thing," Grayson called out, voice cracking with tension. A strange lull fell over the German positions. The incoming fire slackened, then stopped entirely. Holloway signaled for his men to cease fire, straining to hear over the wind. In the sudden quiet, the storm's voice dominated, a constant penetrating moan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "They're pulling back," Hayes muttered, peering cautiously around his cover. "No," Holloway replied. "They're regrouping." This storm caught them off guard too. He studied the white void where moments before he could see movement. But it won't hold them off for long. The full force of the Arctic front had hit them now. The snow fell so thickly that visibility had dropped to less than 20 feet. Wind gusts threatened to knock a man off his feet, driving the cold through layers of wool and cotton as if they weren't there. Holloway's mind shifted from combat to survival mode. His years as an engineer before the war had taught him to analyze problems systematically, to see solutions where others saw only obstacles. And right now the most immediate problem was staying alive in temperatures that could kill as efficiently as any bullet. "We need shelter," he announced, moving between his remaining men. "Hayes, Grayson, start digging into that snowbank. We need a snow cave, deep enough for all of us." "A what?" Grayson asked, his young face already reddened from the cold. "Snow insulates," Holloway explained tersely. "Traps body heat. It's our best chance until this passes." Hayes nodded in understanding, already using his helmet to scoop snow. "Smart. Learned that trick in Norway. Lost fewer men to the cold than to the Germans." Holloway turned to Ortega, who was still huddled with his radio. "Any luck?" "Nothing from our side," Ortega replied, his dark eyes intense with concentration. "But I'm picking up German transmissions. The storm's actually helping. Their signals, bouncing off the cloud layer, amplifying it." Holloway felt a spark of hope. "Can you understand what they're saying?" Ortega nodded, pressing the headphones tighter to his ears. "My German's rusty, but good enough. They're confused. The sudden weather change has disrupted their communications too." He paused, listening intently. "Someone named Hauptmann Voss keeps being mentioned. Sounds like he's their commander." "What's he saying?" "He's ordering his men to secure their perimeter. Some of his officers are suggesting they call off the search until the storm passes." Ortega's face tensed with concentration. "Voss is hesitating. He knows we've seen their artillery positions. Says we can't be allowed to report back." Holloway absorbed this information, mind racing. "So we have a reprieve. But not for long." He moved to help Hayes and Grayson, who had already excavated a depression in the large snowbank. Working methodically, they tunneled horizontally into the packed snow, creating a low-ceilinged chamber just large enough for 4 men to huddle in close quarters. "Get in," Holloway ordered once they'd finished. "Body heat is our best resource now." They crawled inside, positioning themselves in a tight circle. Ortega brought the radio, setting it between them. Outside, the storm raged with increasing ferocity, but the snow cave muffled its howl to a distant moan. "What's the plan, Lieutenant?" Hayes asked, his breath fogging in the enclosed space. "We're still trapped. Storm or no storm, those Krauts aren't going anywhere. And neither are we if we don't warm up," Holloway replied, noticing Grayson's hands. The young soldier was trying to work the bolt of his rifle, but his fingers had turned an alarming shade of white. "Grayson, stop that. Give me your hands." The corporal looked up, confusion in his eyes. "I was just checking my weapon, sir." "Your hands are starting to freeze," Holloway said firmly. "Remove your gloves." When Grayson complied, revealing chalk-white fingers with blue tips, Hayes swore under his breath. "That's early frostbite. Kid, didn't they teach you anything in basic?" I didn't notice," Grayson stammered. "They just went numb." "That's the first warning sign," Holloway explained, taking the young man's hands between his own. Blood vessels constrict to preserve core temperature. Hayes, your canteen still have coffee in it? The sergeant nodded, producing a battered canteen. Lukewarm at best. It'll do. Holloway opened it and guided Grayson's hands around the metal container. Hold this. The warmth will help restore circulation. Once you feel pins and needles, that's good. Means blood flow is returning. Grayson nodded, wincing as sensation began to return to his fingertips. Hayes watched the procedure with grudging approval. Where'd you learn that, sir? Don't recall that being in officer training. Built bridges in Alaska before the war, Holloway replied. Lost 2 toes my first winter there. Quick lesson in respecting the cold. Outside, the wind briefly intensified, driving snow through the entrance of their shelter. Holloway peered out at the white nothingness beyond, his engineer's mind calculating, adapting. This storm, he said slowly. It's changing everything. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Changing it for the worse, I'd say. We're still outnumbered, still cut off, and now we're fighting the weather too. Or it's fighting for us, Holloway countered, a plan taking shape in his mind. Think about it. The Germans are as blind as we are right now. Their communications are compromised. Their men are seeking shelter, focusing inward. So we wait it out? Grayson asked hopefully, still cradling the canteen. Holloway shook his head. No, we use it. He turned to Ortega. Keep monitoring their communications. I need to know if Voss changes his orders or if there's any mention of their patrol patterns. Hayes studied Holloway's face, understanding dawning in his eyes. You're not thinking of trying to break through their lines. That's exactly what I'm thinking. Holloway's voice hardened with resolve. This storm is the only advantage we're going to get. We can't outfight them, but maybe we can outthink them. To do what exactly? Hayes challenged. Even if we slip through their lines, we're still miles from friendly territory with no radio contact. We don't need to reach friendly territory, Holloway replied. We just need to neutralize those artillery positions. A charged silence filled the snow cave. What Holloway was proposing wasn't just risky, it bordered on suicide. Sir? Ortega spoke up, still listening intently to his headphones. I'm picking up more chatter. Voss is ordering patrols to continue, but at reduced intervals. They're pulling some men back to their camp. The cold is taking a toll on their equipment too. Some of their weapons are freezing up. Hayes exhaled slowly, frost crystallizing in his beard. So we have gaps to exploit. Exactly, Holloway confirmed. And we have another advantage. They think they have us pinned here. They'll be looking outward, not inward. Grayson looked between the 2 older soldiers, his face pale. You're saying we go toward them? Into their camp? It's the last thing they'll expect, Holloway said simply. Hayes shook his head, but there was a glint of grim appreciation in his eyes. It's crazy, he muttered. But I've seen crazier plans work. He glanced at Grayson's recovering hands. The kid's not ready for this, though. His hands are barely functioning. I'm okay, Grayson protested, flexing his fingers gingerly. The feeling's coming back. He'll have to be ready, Holloway said, more harshly than he intended. We all need to be ready. He softened his tone, meeting Grayson's anxious gaze. This isn't just about us anymore, Corporal. Those artillery pieces we saw, they're positioned to hit our forward bases. Thousands of our boys are in those bases with no idea what's coming. The weight of that responsibility settled over the small shelter. Grayson swallowed hard, then nodded. Holloway turned back to Ortega. What else can you tell me about this Voss? Ortega listened for a moment longer, then responded. From what I can gather, he's some kind of professor turned officer. The men respect him. He's being methodical about the search, conserving resources. Smart, Hayes commented. Hate fighting the smart ones. Is he? Holloway hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Is he the type to execute prisoners? The question hung in the frigid air. They all knew what happened sometimes when small units were captured far behind enemy lines. Officially, prisoners were to be treated according to Geneva Conventions. Reality often proved different. Ortega shrugged. Hard to tell from radio chatter. He sounds professional, but also determined to prevent us from reporting what we've seen. Holloway nodded. Decision made. Then we don't get captured. He brushed snow from his map case and spread a tattered map on the ground between them. Here's what we know. Their main camp is here, about a mile south. Artillery positions here, here, and here. Hayes studied the markings. Those gun emplacements will have extra security. Agreed. But they'll also be vulnerable. Holloway tapped the map. These are 88s. Powerful, but complex. They need to be precisely calibrated, especially in changing weather conditions. And they're vulnerable to frost. You've fought them before, Hayes deduced. In North Africa, Holloway confirmed. Different climate, but same principles. They'll be scrambling to protect the firing mechanisms and shells from this kind of cold. He traced a route with his finger. We move under cover of the storm, use the reduced visibility to our advantage, plant explosives here and here where they store the ammunition. Even if we only disable a few guns, it could save hundreds of our men. Hayes considered the plan, his expression unreadable. And if we're spotted? We won't be, Holloway said with more confidence than he felt. Not if we time it right. Lieutenant, Ortega interrupted, his expression changing as he listened to the headphones. New transmissions. Sounds like they're having equipment problems. Voss is ordering essential personnel only to remain with the artillery. He's moving most men to the main camp until the storm passes. A grim smile touched Holloway's lips. That's our window. Outside, the fury of the storm reached a new intensity. The wind screamed across the plateau, driving snow horizontally with such force it scoured exposed rock faces clean while building massive drifts in sheltered areas. The temperature continued to plummet, transforming the Ardennes into an Arctic wasteland. It's getting worse out there, Grayson observed nervously. Good, Holloway replied. The worse it gets, the better our chances. He checked his watch. We move at nightfall. That gives us about 3 hours to prepare. Hayes gave him a long, appraising look. This is a hell of a gamble, Lieutenant. The alternative is we sit here and wait to freeze or be captured, Holloway countered. At least this way, we die trying to accomplish something. The sergeant held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. I'm in. Me too, Ortega added, setting aside his headphones. I'd rather go down fighting than freeze to death in this hole. All eyes turned to Grayson. The young soldier looked down at his hands, now red and painful as circulation returned. When he looked up again, something had changed in his expression. A hardening, an acceptance. I didn't join this man's army to hide in the snow, he said quietly. Holloway felt a surge of pride in his men, against impossible odds, facing both a ruthless enemy and the brutal indifference of nature. They hadn't surrendered to despair. Check your weapons, he ordered. Make sure nothing's frozen up. Distribute what ammunition we have left. Hayes, you still have those grenades from the supply drop last week? 3 left, Hayes confirmed. Plus some C2 I've been saving for a special occasion. A grim smile crossed his weathered face. Guess this qualifies. As the men prepared, Holloway stepped to the entrance of their snow shelter, staring out at the white fury beyond. The storm had transformed the forest into an alien landscape, beautiful and lethal. He felt the cold slice through his uniform, a reminder of how thin the margin between survival and death had become. Behind him, Hayes approached. Something on your mind, Lieutenant? Holloway didn't turn. Thinking about Normandy. About the men. We lost there. Hayes was quiet for a moment. That wasn't on you. We both know it. I was their commanding officer. They trusted me to get them home. War doesn't make those kinds of promises, Hayes said simply. You did what you could, same as you're doing now. Holloway finally turned to face the sergeant. If this goes sideways, it probably will, Hayes interrupted with a hint of gallows humor. If it does, Holloway continued, get Ortega and Grayson out if you can. They're young. They deserve a chance. Hayes's expression hardened. With all due respect, sir, we go together or not at all. I didn't survive 3 years of this God-forsaken war to start leaving men behind now. Before Holloway could respond, Ortega called from inside the shelter. Lieutenant, German transmission. They're pulling more men back to the main camp. The storm's getting too intense for regular patrols. Holloway exchanged a look with Hayes. Looks like our window just opened earlier than expected. The sergeant patted the explosives in his pack. Time to give Hauptmann Voss something new to worry about. Night was falling now, the dark gray of the storm deepening to near blackness. Holloway gathered his men around him. Their faces were grim but determined in the fading light. 4 men against a battalion, with only a blizzard for an ally. Remember, he said quietly, we move together. Silent. Stay low. If we get separated, head for the rendezvous point we marked on the map. He looked each man in the eye. This isn't about getting home anymore. It's about making sure those artillery pieces never fire. They nodded in understanding. Let's move out, Holloway ordered, turning to face the storm. One by one, they crawled from their shelter into the howling darkness, swallowed almost immediately by the swirling snow. The brutal cold hit them like a physical force, wind-driven, ice crystals stinging any exposed skin. Visibility had dropped to mere feet, forcing them to stay close enough to touch the man ahead. As they began their descent from the plateau, Holloway felt a strange calm settle over him. The odds were overwhelming, the conditions lethal, and yet there was clarity in the mission now. They were no longer running or hiding. They were hunting. The world had narrowed to a white void. Lieutenant Holloway could barely see Hayes 3 feet ahead of him as they descended the steep slope. The sergeant's form little more than a darker shadow against the swirling curtain of snow. Behind Holloway came Grayson, then Ortega, a human chain linked by necessity and desperation, each man gripping the equipment harness of the one ahead. The wind's howl provided perfect cover, swallowing the crunch of their boots and the occasional muttered curse when someone slipped on the treacherous ground. But that same wind drove ice crystals like tiny needles against any exposed skin, and the temperature continued to plummet. Holloway could feel the cold seeping through his inadequate winter gear, numbing his extremities despite his constant movement. His mind, however, remained razor-sharp. The engineer in him had already mapped their route, calculating angles and distances even as the storm rendered visual landmarks useless. They followed the contours of the land, using the slope to guide them toward where German sentries would be weakest, the northern approach to the artillery positions where the terrain was steepest and the storm would hit hardest. Hayes stopped suddenly, raising a fist. Holloway halted, feeling Grayson bump into him from behind. They crouched lower, straining to hear over the wind's moan. Through the white curtain, Holloway caught a flicker of movement, a darker shape trudging through the snow perhaps 15 yards away. A German sentry, head bowed against the storm, following what must be a preset patrol route. Hayes looked back, meeting Holloway's eyes with a questioning glance. Holloway shook his head slightly, no engagement unless necessary. They remained, frozen as the sentry passed, oblivious to their presence, the storm rendering him as blind as they were. When the German disappeared into the whiteness, Hayes leaned close to Holloway's ear. "Poor bastard can't see his hand in front of his face," he whispered. "Their lines are stretched thin." Holloway nodded. "We're close to their perimeter. Step carefully." They resumed their advance, moving even more slowly now. Twice more they encountered sentries, each time freezing in place until the danger passed. The Germans were maintaining their patrols, but the brutal conditions had reduced their effectiveness to near zero. After what felt like hours but was likely only 40 minutes, Hayes signaled another halt. This time he pointed downslope, where a faint yellowish glow diffused through the snow curtain, light from the German camp. Holloway moved up beside Hayes, squinting through the flying snow. They had reached the edge of the German perimeter. From what little he could make out, the camp was arranged in concentric rings, outer defenses, then a cluster of tents and vehicles, and at the center, the precious artillery pieces, barely visible as hulking shadows. "We made it," Grayson whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Not yet," Holloway cautioned. "The hard part starts now. He studied what he could see of the camp layout, comparing it to his mental map. Despite the near-zero visibility, the lights from the camp provided enough reference points to orient himself. There, he pointed to a darker area between two faint light sources. That's our entry point, between those two guard positions. Hayes nodded grimly. And then? We split into two teams, Holloway decided. You and Grayson circle left toward the ammunition depot. Ortega and I go right toward the command center. Plant the charges where they'll do the most damage, then rendezvous. Back here in 30 minutes. Hayes raised an eyebrow. You sure about splitting up in this? He gestured at the blinding snowstorm. No, Holloway admitted. But we need to hit multiple targets if we want to cripple those guns. Time isn't on our side. The sergeant considered this, then nodded. 30 minutes. Not a second longer. Holloway unfolded his map, shielding it from the snow as best he could. If anything goes wrong, head northeast. There's a ridgeline 5 miles from here. Get over it, and you should run into Allied patrols eventually. Nothing's going to go wrong, Grayson said with forced bravado, though his voice quavered slightly. Hayes clapped the young soldier on the shoulder. That's the spirit, kid. Keep telling yourself that. He turned to Holloway. We'll take the west side charges. Bigger bang. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Holloway nodded, handing over the explosives. Then, with a final glance at his men, he gestured for Ortega to follow him into the storm. The two teams separated, disappearing into the white void from opposite directions. Holloway and Ortega crept forward, hunched low, using the storm and darkness as cover. The wind moaned across the landscape, creating haunting, disorienting sounds that seemed to come from everywhere at once. As they neared the outer perimeter, Holloway spotted a lone sentry stamping his feet against the cold, rifle slung over his shoulder, hands tucked beneath his armpits for warmth. The German's attention was focused inward, toward the meager comfort of the camp, not outward into the teeth of the blizzard. Holloway touched Ortega's arm, pointing at the ground. They dropped to their stomachs, crawling forward through the deepening snow. The cold bit through Holloway's uniform, but he focused on the mission, inching forward foot by foot until they were past the sentry's position. Once inside the perimeter, they encountered a strange, almost surreal landscape. The storm had transformed the German camp into a place of shadows and half-seen forms. Tents sagged under the weight of accumulated snow. Vehicles sat like sleeping beasts, slowly vanishing beneath white drifts. Occasionally, soldiers hurried between shelters, heads bowed against the wind, so focused on their misery that they failed to notice the two Americans moving stealthily among them. It's like we're ghosts, Ortega whispered, his words barely reaching Holloway's ears despite their proximity. Holloway nodded. The analogy was apt. They moved through the enemy camp as insubstantial as specters, the storm rendering them nearly invisible. They worked their way toward where intelligence had indicated the command center would be, a larger tent structure near the center of the camp. Holloway's plan was to gather what intelligence he could, then plant explosives at critical junctures where they would cause maximum disruption. Halfway there, Ortega suddenly gripped Holloway's arm, pointing to a partially snow-covered sign. Even through the whiteout conditions, the radio man's keen eyes had spotted something important. Holloway squinted at the German lettering. Munitions Vorrat. Ammunition storage, Ortega translated. Wasn't on our intel. Holloway considered this unexpected discovery. According to their information, the main ammunition depot should be on the western side of the camp, where Hayes and Grayson were headed. This must be a secondary supply point, and an opportunity they couldn't pass up. Change of plans, he whispered. We take this out first, then continue to the command center if time allows. Ortega nodded, already retrieving the explosives from his pack. They approached the ammunition tent cautiously. A single guard stood at the entrance, shoulders hunched against the cold, stamping his feet periodically. His misery was evident even from a distance, a man whose attention was focused more on his own discomfort than on potential threats. Holloway gestured for Ortega to circle around. They would need to neutralize the guard silently to avoid raising an alarm. Drawing his combat knife, Holloway crept closer, using a line of half-buried crates for cover. The snow muffled his footsteps, and the guard remained oblivious, occasionally blowing into his gloved hands. 20 feet away, then 10. Holloway tensed, preparing to rush forward. Just then the tent flap opened, spilling yellow light onto the snow. The guard turned toward it, and another German soldier emerged, saying something Holloway couldn't catch. Both men were now facing directly toward his position. Holloway froze, exposed in the open with nowhere to hide. For a heart-stopping moment, he was certain they would spot him, a dark figure against the white snow. But the storm proved its worth once again. A powerful gust swept through the camp, driving a wall of snow between him and the Germans. Both soldiers ducked their heads against the onslaught, cursing the weather, their attention diverted from the American crouched just yards away. Taking advantage of the moment, Holloway closed the remaining distance. The first soldier never saw him coming. Holloway's hand clamped over his mouth as the knife found its mark. The second barely had time to register surprise before Ortega emerged from the other side, striking with similar efficiency. They dragged both bodies behind the tent, covering them with snow. The entire encounter had lasted less than 15 seconds, and the storm had swallowed any sound. "Quick work," Holloway acknowledged, wiping his blade clean. Ortega's expression was grim, but resolved. Like most of them, he took no pleasure in killing, but understood its necessity. They slipped inside the ammunition tent, finding it mercifully empty of additional personnel. The interior was lined with wooden crates stamped with German markings, artillery shells, mortar rounds, and small arms ammunition, all neatly organized. Working quickly, they planted their explosives at strategic points, setting the timers for 20 minutes. Enough time to reach their rendezvous point, but not so long that the charges might be discovered. "Let's move," Holloway ordered once they'd finished. Back outside, the storm had, if anything, intensified. The wind howled with renewed fury, driving the snow horizontally with such force that visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Holloway checked his compass, orienting himself toward where Hayes and Grayson should be operating. "Think they're having any luck?" Ortega asked as they pushed through knee-deep drifts. "Hayes knows what he's doing," Holloway replied, though privately he worried. In these conditions, anything could go wrong. On the western edge of the camp, Sergeant Hayes and Corporal Grayson had successfully infiltrated their target area. Like Holloway and Ortega, they found the Germans far more concerned with the brutal weather than with security. The storm had created a kind of collective blindness. Sentries huddled in whatever shelter they could find. Patrols rushed through their routes with minimal vigilance, and the usual sharp discipline of German forces had eroded under nature's onslaught. "Almost too easy," Hayes muttered as they crouched behind a half-track, watching a patrol hurry past without so much as a glance in their direction. Grayson, his young face taut with tension, said nothing. His hands gripped his rifle so tightly that his knuckles showed white even in the dim light. Despite the cold, sweat beaded on his forehead, the physical manifestation of fear fighting against training. Hayes noted the young soldier's condition with concern. He'd seen it before. The paralysis that could grip men in their first real combat situation. It wasn't cowardice. It was the mind rebelling against the unnatural act of killing. He'd have to watch the kid closely. They worked their way toward the main ammunition depot, a large half-buried bunker set away from the main camp for safety. Unlike the smaller storage tent Holloway had discovered, this facility was more substantially guarded, with 2 sentries at the entrance despite the weather. Hayes studied the situation from behind a stack of empty fuel drums. "No way past them without raising an alarm," he whispered. Grayson tensed. "So what do we do?" The sergeant's weathered face hardened. "We take them out." He turned to the younger man. "You're the sharpshooter. 2 targets, 2 shots. Can you handle that?" Grayson's eyes widened. Until now, most of his combat experience had been theoretical, target practice and simulations. I've never," he stammered. "They're the enemy," Hayes said flatly. "If we don't stop these guns from firing, a lot of our boys die. It's that simple." Grayson swallowed hard, then nodded once. He moved into position, raising his rifle and sighting through the swirling snow. His breath came in short, sharp bursts as he centered his crosshairs on the first German sentry. But he didn't fire. Seconds stretched into nearly a minute as Grayson remained frozen, finger on the trigger but unable to pull it. Hayes watched, his concern growing. The longer they remained exposed, the greater their chances of discovery. "I can't," Grayson finally whispered, lowering the rifle. "They're just standing there. They don't even know we're here." Hayes's expression remained neutral, though inwardly he understood the young soldier's struggle. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but intense. "Those men down there? They're part of a unit that's about to kill thousands of our guys. Friends of yours, boys you trained with." He gripped Grayson's shoulder hard. "This isn't murder, it's war. You pull that trigger or those artillery pieces fire tomorrow, and the blood of every man they kill is on us." Grayson's face contorted with the moral weight of the decision. After a long moment, he raised his rifle again, steadied his breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The report was swallowed by the howling wind, but the first sentry crumpled to the ground. Before the second could react, Grayson had chambered another round and fired again. The second sentry fell beside the first. "Good work," Hayes said simply, already moving forward. But Grayson remained where he was for a moment, staring at the fallen Germans through his scope. Something fundamental had changed. In his eyes, a boundary crossed that could never be uncrossed. When he finally lowered his rifle and followed Hayes, his movements were mechanical, his expression distant. They reached the ammunition bunker without further incident. Inside, they found what they'd hoped for: stacks of artillery shells, carefully arranged and labeled. Working efficiently, Hayes began placing explosives at key points while Grayson kept watch at the entrance. "Set for 15 minutes, Hayes announced as he finished. "That gives us time to reach the rendezvous point." As they exited the bunker, the storm seemed to part momentarily, creating an eerie pocket of reduced wind and visibility. In that brief moment, Grayson spotted movement, a German patrol moving in their direction, alerted perhaps by the bodies of the sentries they'd neutralized. "Patrol coming," he hissed. Hayes assessed the situation with the calm efficiency of a veteran. "Too many to engage. We need to move now." They retreated into the swirling whiteness, using the storm as cover, circling wide around the approaching Germans. For several tense minutes they navigated through the camp's perimeter, always just one chance encounter away from discovery. Finally, they reached the rendezvous point, finding no sign of Holloway or Ortega. "Where are they?" Grayson whispered, anxiety evident in his voice. Hayes checked his watch. "Still have 7 minutes, they'll be here." But his expression betrayed his own concern. In these conditions, anything could delay them, or worse. Across the camp, Holloway and Ortega faced their own complications. After planting their explosives, in the secondary ammunition depot, they had attempted to reach the command center as originally planned. But the storm had disoriented them, leading them instead into the artillery positions themselves. Massive 88mm guns stood in a neat line, their long barrels pointed skyward, slowly disappearing under accumulating snow. Crews had erected makeshift shelters beside each gun, where men huddled against the cold, maintaining minimal watch on their valuable equipment. Holloway recognized the unexpected opportunity. While not part of their original plan, disabling the guns directly would ensure their mission's success even if the ammunition depots somehow survived. "Change of plans," he whispered to Ortega. "We use our remaining charges on the firing mechanisms. Even if the ammo survives, they won't be able to use it." Ortega nodded, retrieving the last of their explosives. They moved from gun to gun, planting small charges in the breech mechanisms, not enough to destroy the massive weapons entirely, but sufficient to render them inoperable. German artillery crews, more concerned with staying warm than maintaining security, remained oblivious to the Americans working just yards away. They had nearly finished with the last gun when a voice called out in German from behind them. Holloway turned to see a figure approaching through the snow. An officer by his bearing, though details were obscured by the storm. The officer called out again, his tone shifting from questioning to alarmed. as he realized the men by the gun were not his own. "Run," Holloway ordered, shoving Ortega toward the darkness beyond the guns. The German officer shouted an alert, reaching for his sidearm. Holloway charged him, tackling the man before he could fire. They crashed to the ground, struggling in the deep snow. The German was younger but strong, fighting with the desperate energy of a man who understood the stakes. Holloway managed to pin one of the officer's arms, but the German landed a solid blow to his jaw with his free hand. Stars exploded in Holloway's vision. He tasted blood, felt the world tilt around him. The sound of a gunshot cracked through the howling wind. The German officer stiffened, then went limp beneath Holloway. Looking up, he saw Ortega standing a few feet away, pistol still raised. "We need to move," the radio man said urgently. "That shot will bring others." Holloway staggered to his feet, wiping blood from his split lip. He grabbed his fallen rifle and nodded to Ortega. "Let's go." They had barely made it 20 yards when a burst of machine gun fire ripped through the air around them. Holloway felt rather than heard Ortega's grunt of pain as the radio man stumbled. "I'm hit," Ortega gasped, clutching his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark against the snow. Holloway grabbed him, half dragging, half carrying the wounded man as they pushed through the deepening snow. Behind them, German voices shouted commands. The element of surprise was gone. Now it was a race against both the enemy and the clock. "How bad?" Holloway asked as they stumbled forward. "Could be worse," Ortega managed through gritted teeth. "Round went through clean, I think." Holloway supported his weight as they continued their retreat, following his compass heading toward the rendezvous point. The storm closed around them once more, obscuring their escape from their pursuers. But the Germans were now fully alerted, and the camp had erupted into activity despite the weather. After what seemed an eternity, they reached the rendezvous point, finding Hayes and Grayson waiting anxiously. "What happened?" Hayes demanded, seeing Ortega's condition. "We were spotted," Holloway explained tersely. "Charges are set, but the whole camp's on alert now." Hayes swore under his breath. "Our charges are set too. Timer's down to—" He checked his watch. 4 minutes. "We need to move," Holloway ordered. "Hayes, help me with Ortega." The sergeant moved to support Ortega's other side, and together they began their ascent back up the slope, away from the German camp. Grayson took point, leading them through the treacherous terrain as quickly as conditions allowed. Behind them, sirens began to wail, barely audible over the storm. The Germans had found either the bodies or the explosives. Holloway pushed harder, knowing that once the charges detonated, the entire area would be swarming with enemy soldiers. They had made it perhaps 500 yards from the camp perimeter when the night erupted behind them. Even through the howling storm, the first explosion was unmistakable, a deep concussive boom that they felt in their bones. It was followed seconds later by a larger blast as the ammunition depot detonated, and then a series of secondary explosions as stored shells cooked off. The snow around them briefly lit with an orange glow, casting eerie shadows through the whiteout conditions. The sound echoed across the landscape, amplified by the mountains. "That ought to wake them up," Hayes remarked grimly. More explosions followed as their charges at the artillery positions detonated, triggering additional secondary blasts. The German camp had become a chaotic inferno behind them, flames fighting against the storm's fury. Ortega smiled weakly through his pain. "Mission accomplished," he murmured. "Not yet," Holloway countered. "Mission's accomplished when we all get back alive." They continued their laborious ascent, fighting against both the slope and the deepening snow. Ortega grew heavier between them, his strength fading as blood loss and cold took their toll. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit faded, either abandoned due to the storm or redirected to battle the fires raging through the camp. But Holloway took no comfort in this reprieve. The storm, which had been their ally in infiltrating the German position, now worked against them. Visibility remained near zero, the temperature continued to drop, and the wind drove snow and ice with merciless force. As they struggled onward, Holloway caught Hayes's eye over Ortega's sagging head. Both men recognized the grim truth. They had succeeded in their mission, but their fight for survival was far from over. The storm, indifferent to the human conflict it had influenced, was intensifying, turning the Ardennes into a frozen hell from which escape would require every bit of skill and determination they possessed. And somewhere behind them, in the midst of the chaos they'd created, Hauptmann Voss surveyed the wreckage of his artillery positions. As reports filtered in of the precision with which the American saboteurs had struck, a grudging respect formed in his analytical mind. This was no ordinary enemy. This was an adversary of equal cunning, who had turned the storm itself into a weapon. Voss's cold eyes scanned the whiteness beyond the camp perimeter. They were out there somewhere, trying to escape. With methodical precision, he began organizing search parties, determined not to let these phantom adversaries slip away entirely. The storm had turned the battlefield into a realm of ghosts and shadows, where friend and foe became indistinguishable. But some ghosts, Voss knew, left tracks, and he intended to follow them. The explosions still echoed behind them, muffled by the howling storm, as Holloway and Hayes half-carried, half-dragged Ortega through the deepening snow. Every step was a battle against nature's fury. The wind had shifted, now driving directly into their faces, carrying ice particles that stung like tiny razors against any exposed skin. "We need to find shelter," Hayes shouted over the wind's roar. "He's losing too much blood." Holloway nodded, grimly, though the gesture was likely invisible in the near whiteout conditions. Ortega hung limply between them, his breathing shallow, his uniform stiff with frozen blood around the bullet wound in his side. The radio man had stopped responding to their questions minutes ago. A bad sign. Grayson trudged ahead, breaking a path through snow that now reached mid-thigh in some drifts. The young soldier moved mechanically, his earlier transformation still evident in his vacant stare. The killing had changed him, just as it changed all men who survived long enough in war. "Lieutenant," Hayes called out, his voice barely audible, despite their proximity. "We're losing our bearings. This storm is pushing us off course." Holloway paused, shifting Ortega's weight to free one hand. He fumbled for his compass, squinting at it in the darkness. The small instrument, their lifeline in this white void, trembled violently in his hand, not from the wind, but from the uncontrollable shaking that had begun to overtake his limbs. The cold was sinking deeper now, past clothing, past skin, into bone and muscle. The compass needle swung erratically, then stabilized. Holloway's heart sank. They had indeed drifted far off course, pushed westward by the relentless wind. Their planned route back to the snow cave shelter was now miles away, across terrain that would be nearly impossible to navigate in current conditions. "We need to adjust," he shouted back. 40 degrees east." Hayes nodded, and they changed direction, struggling against the crosswind. Grayson followed the new heading without question, his face a frozen mask. Ortega's weight seemed to increase with every step, the unconscious man becoming a literal dead weight between them. Time lost meaning in the white void. Minutes or hours could have passed as they fought their way forward, one agonizing step at a time. The cold became a living thing, probing for weaknesses, seeping through layers of clothing, numbing extremities, clouding judgment. Holloway found himself fighting not just the snow and wind, but his own deteriorating mental state. Hypothermia's insidious effects began to manifest, the violent shivering, the confusion, the overwhelming urge to simply stop and rest. "Keep moving," Hayes bellowed periodically, sometimes to Grayson, sometimes to Holloway, sometimes seemingly to himself. "Stop moving, you die." The words became a rhythm, a mantra that drove them forward when their bodies screamed to surrender to the cold's embrace. Grayson stumbled suddenly, pitching forward into a snowdrift. For long seconds he didn't move, and Holloway felt a spike of alarm. "Grayson!" he shouted. "On your feet!" The young soldier remained face down in the snow. "God damn it," Hayes muttered. They lowered Ortega as gently as possible, then Hayes trudged forward and hauled Grayson up bodily. The corporal's face was frighteningly pale, his lips blue, eyes unfocused. "I can't." Grayson mumbled, his words slurred. Can't keep going. Hayes slapped him hard across the face. Yes, you can, and you will. You think those men you shot would lie down and die out here? They'd fight till their last breath, and so will you. Something sparked in Grayson's vacant eyes. Anger, perhaps, or simple survival instinct. He straightened slightly, nodding once. That's it, Hayes urged. One foot in front of the other. The only way out is through. Holloway watched the exchange with detached concern. A distant part of his mind recognized that all four of them were in advanced stages of exposure. Without shelter soon, none would survive the night. They resumed, their march, Holloway and Hayes once again bearing Ortega's weight between them. The radio man's breathing had grown so shallow as to be nearly imperceptible. Only the occasional puff of condensation from his lips indicated he still lived. Holloway found his mind wandering down strange paths, memories of Alaska, of building bridges across frozen rivers, of the engineering principles that allowed structures to withstand extreme cold. He knew this mental meandering was dangerous, a symptom of his body's core temperature dropping to critical levels. But the memories came unbidden, blurring the line between past and present. Hayes's voice cut through the fugue. Lieutenant, look! Holloway blinked, forcing himself back to the present. Following Hayes's pointing finger, he made out a darker shape looming through the storm. Something large and solid. Not natural terrain. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into the fractured outline of a vehicle, a German supply truck, partially buried in a snowdrift, its front end crumpled against a tree. Whether it had crashed due to the storm or been abandoned for mechanical failure was impossible to tell. Shelter, Holloway croaked, his voice rough from the cold. They altered course, making directly for the truck. As they approached, Hayes handed his share of Ortega's weight to Grayson and moved ahead, weapon at the ready despite his numbed hands. He circled the vehicle cautiously, checking for occupants or threats, then called back. Clear. Driver's gone. Looks like he lost control in the storm. Holloway and Grayson maneuvered Ortega to the back of the truck. The canvas covering over the cargo bed was still intact, creating a crude shelter from the direct force of the wind. Hayes helped them lift the wounded man inside, then they all clambered in, collapsing onto the metal floor in exhaustion. The relief of being out of the direct wind was immediate, though the temperature inside the truck remained well below freezing. Hayes immediately began checking the cargo, searching through crates and containers by the dim light of his covered flashlight. Medical supplies, he announced, holding up a small metal box. And better yet, blankets, German wool, and rations. Holloway nodded, already turning his attention to Ortega. He pulled open the radio man's blood-soaked jacket, inspecting the wound. The bullet had entered just above the hip and exited through the back, a clean through and through that had miraculously missed vital organs. But the blood loss and exposure had taken a severe toll. Working with hands that refused to stop shaking, Holloway used supplies from the medical kit to clean and bandage the wound. Hayes, meanwhile, wrapped blankets around Grayson, who sat shivering uncontrollably, his eyes fixed on nothing. He's going into shock, Hayes observed quietly. Cold, exhaustion, and what happened back there. He didn't need to elaborate. They both understood that Grayson's first kill had broken something in the young soldier's mind, something that the brutal march through the storm had only exacerbated. Get some rations into him, Holloway ordered. Sugar, if they have it. We need to get his core temperature up. Hayes nodded, rummaging through the German field rations until he found something suitable, hard candy and a tin of preserved meat. He coaxed Grayson to eat, speaking in the rough but gentle tone of a veteran who had seen this condition before. Holloway finished tending to Ortega, then wrapped him in 2 blankets. The radio man's breathing had steadied somewhat, but his skin remained alarmingly cold, his pulse weak and thready. Only when both injured men were stabilized did Holloway allow himself to sink back against the truck's wall, the full weight of exhaustion crashing over him. Hayes handed him a blanket and a portion of the rations without comment. How bad? Hayes asked, gesturing toward Ortega. Bad, Holloway replied simply. without proper medical attention soon? He let the implication hang in the frigid air between them. Hayes nodded, understanding perfectly. And the kid? Holloway glanced at Grayson, who had fallen into a fitful doze, twitching and mumbling occasionally. Physical symptoms of hypothermia are responding to treatment. The rest? He shook his head. Some men bounce back from their first kill. Others never do. He'll make it, Hayes said with certainty. Got a solid core, that one. Just needs time. Holloway wasn't so sure, but he appreciated Hayes's unwavering confidence. It was one of the qualities that made the sergeant invaluable, his ability to remain steadfast when all around him was chaos. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, the wind battering the canvas covering, driving snow through every tiny gap in their shelter. The temperature kept dropping, the cold seeping through the metal floor of the truck despite the blankets. Holloway knew their reprieve was temporary at best. The truck provided shelter from the wind but little actual warmth. We can't stay here long, he said after a while. We need to find better shelter, somewhere we can build a fire. Hayes nodded grimly. The question is where, and how far. Holloway closed his eyes, mentally reviewing what he knew of the terrain. Their original snow cave was unreachable now, miles away across the storm-ravaged landscape. They were in unfamiliar territory, driven off course by the wind in their desperate escape from the German camp. We need to rest first, he decided. 2 hours. Then we move on, heading east. Hayes didn't question the decision, though they both knew that moving Ortega again would further reduce his already slim chances of survival. The brutal calculus of command. Risk one man's life in the hope of saving all four, or remain in inadequate shelter until they all succumbed to the cold. Holloway felt the weight of command pressing down on him. Heavier than the cold, heavier than exhaustion. 2 men already dead, 1 critically wounded and 1 bordering on psychological breakdown. And they were still miles from friendly lines in the midst of the worst winter storm he'd ever encountered, with a determined enemy somewhere behind them. He must have dozed off because the next thing he knew, Hayes was shaking him roughly. "Lieutenant, Lieutenant!" Holloway jerked awake, instinctively reaching for his weapon. "Easy," Hayes cautioned. "Listen." Holloway froze, straining his ears. Through the storm's howl, he caught it, the distant rumble of engines. "Germans," he breathed. Hayes nodded grimly. "Search parties, most likely. Moving slow in this weather, but moving." Holloway checked his watch, shocked to discover that nearly 3 hours had passed while he slept. The trembling in his limbs had subsided somewhat, though the deep, bone-aching cold remained. "We need to move," he said, already checking Ortega. The radio man's condition had marginally improved. His skin was warmer to the touch, his breathing more regular, but moving him would still be dangerous. Hayes nodded toward Grayson, who sat huddled in his blanket staring at his hands. The kid's physically better, but his mind still somewhere else. Been talking in his sleep about the men he shot. Holloway moved to kneel in front of Grayson. "Corporal," he said firmly. "I need you present. We're moving out." Grayson looked up slowly, his eyes focusing with visible effort. "Lieutenant," he acknowledged, his voice hollow. "I keep seeing them. The way they fell. They didn't even know what hit them." "That's war," Holloway said, not unkindly. "Clean shots from a distance. That's as merciful as it gets in this business." "But you did your job," Holloway cut him off. "And now I need you to keep doing it. We're not out of this yet." Something hardened in Grayson's gaze. Not resolution exactly, but a kind of resigned acceptance. He nodded once and began gathering his equipment with mechanical precision. They prepared to move out, dividing the salvaged supplies between them. Hayes found a makeshift stretcher in the truck, a canvas panel with wooden handles, designed for evacuating wounded from the battlefield. They carefully transferred Ortega onto it, securing him with straps and wrapping him in additional blankets. "Ready?" Holloway asked, taking the front handles of the stretcher. Hayes nodded, grasping the rear handles. Grayson would lead, breaking trail through the snow and watching for threats. It was the best arrangement they could manage with their limited resources. They emerged from the truck into a world transformed. The storm had shifted yet again, becoming less violent but more insidious. The howling wind had diminished to a steady, persistent flow, but the temperature had plummeted, even further, creating a still crystalline cold that burned the lungs with each breath. The snow continued to fall heavily but vertically now, adding to the already substantial accumulation on the ground. Grayson moved ahead, forging a path eastward according to Holloway's compass reading. Progress was agonizingly slow. The stretcher frequently sank into deeper drifts, requiring Hayes and Holloway to lift and maneuver it with arms that burned from the effort. The cold air seared their lungs, and each exhaled breath transformed instantly into a cloud of ice crystals that clung to scarves, eyebrows, and eyelashes. They had been moving for perhaps half an hour when Ortega stirred on the stretcher, his eyes fluttering open. "Where?" he mumbled, confusion evident in his unfocused gaze. "Easy," Holloway said. "You were hit. We're getting you back to friendly lines." Ortega tried to sit up, then fell back with a grimace of pain. "The mission?" "Successful," Hayes assured him from the rear of the stretcher. "You should have seen those ammo dumps go up. Like the 4th of July, a weak smile crossed Ortega's pale face. "How bad am I hit?" Holloway hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Bad enough. But you're tough. You'll make it." Ortega closed his eyes, conserving strength. "The radio," he murmured. "Did we save the radio?" Holloway and Hayes exchanged glances. In the chaos of their escape, the bulky radio had been abandoned, a necessary sacrifice to evacuate the wounded man. "Afraid not," Holloway admitted, "but it wouldn't have worked in this storm anyway." Ortega nodded faintly, then slipped back into unconsciousness, the brief conversation having depleted his meager reserves of energy. They trudged onward, each step a monumental effort against the deepening snow and their own failing strength. The cold had become a living entity, probing their defenses, seeking weaknesses, striking mercilessly at exposed skin and extremities. Hypothermia stalked them like a patient predator, manifesting in increasingly severe symptoms: violent shivering that gave way to dangerous stillness, confusion, impaired coordination, and the insidious urge to simply lie down and rest. Holloway fought against these effects with every ounce of his remaining willpower. He had seen men die in the cold before, had witnessed the peaceful surrender that preceded freezing to death. The body simply shut down, the mind clouded with false warmth and comfort, convincing the victim that sleep was the answer. But sleep in these conditions meant death, and Holloway refused to surrender. "Keep moving," he ordered repeatedly, as much to himself as to the others. "One more step, just one more." The landscape had become alien and featureless, a white expanse, broken only by the occasional dark smudge of trees or rock outcroppings. Time lost all meaning in the monotony of their struggle, measured only in heartbeats and labored breaths. Grayson, still breaking trail ahead, stopped suddenly, pointing to a dark shape looming through the falling snow. "Structure," he called back, his voice barely audible. Holloway strained to see through the white curtain. Gradually, the shape resolved into the distinctive outline of a barn, a large, solitary structure partially sheltered by a stand of fir trees. "Thank God," Hayes muttered behind him. They altered course toward the building, moving with renewed purpose despite their exhaustion. As they drew closer, details emerged: a stone foundation, weathered wooden walls, a sagging roof thick with snow. It was an old hay barn, likely abandoned before the war began, now standing forgotten in the winter wilderness. Grayson reached it first, circling the perimeter with his rifle ready despite the unlikelihood of finding enemies in such an isolated location. He disappeared around the corner, then reappeared moments later. "Side doors accessible," he reported. "No signs of recent use." Holloway nodded, and they maneuvered the stretcher toward the indicated entrance. The door was partially blocked by a drift, but Grayson cleared enough snow for them to force it open. They carried Ortega inside, finding the interior dim but mercifully sheltered from the direct force of the wind. It was a typical Ardennes barn, high-ceilinged with a hayloft above and stalls below. Long abandoned but structurally sound. Old hay still filled several stalls, dry and brittle but potentially useful as both bedding and fuel. "Get him settled," Holloway ordered, indicating a relatively clean stall with fresh hay. "Then search for anything we can use, especially anything burnable." Hayes and Grayson carefully transferred Ortega to the makeshift bed, while Holloway conducted a more thorough examination of their shelter. The barn was larger than it had appeared from outside, with multiple stalls and storage areas. Most were empty, but one contained abandoned farm implements, an old plow, hand tools, and several empty burlap sacks. More importantly, he discovered a small pot-bellied stove in what must have been a workshop area. The stovepipe was intact, leading up through the loft to the roof. If they could get it working, they might have actual heat, a critical advantage in their fight against the deadly cold. "Hayes," he called. "Found a stove. Seems functional." The sergeant appeared at his side, examining the discovery with a professional, "This might work," he agreed. "Need fuel, though." "There's hay and we can break up some of these empty stalls if needed." Hayes nodded. "I'll get it going." While Hayes worked on the stove, Holloway checked on Ortega, whose condition had deteriorated. Again during the march, the radio man's breathing was shallow and rapid, his skin clammy despite the cold. The bandages on his wound were soaked through with fresh blood. The rough journey had reopened the injury. "How is he?" Grayson asked quietly, appearing at Holloway's shoulder. "Not good," Holloway admitted. "He needs real medical attention, not field first aid." Grayson's face tightened. "Will he make it?" Holloway met the young soldier's eyes directly. "I don't know, but we'll do everything we can." He rewrapped Ortega's wound with fresh bandages from the German medical kit, then covered him with all but one of their salvaged blankets. The radio man's face was ashen, beaded with sweat despite the cold, his lips moving occasionally in wordless delirium. Across the barn, Hayes had succeeded in getting the stove lit. A small fire of hay and broken wood burned within the iron belly of the ancient heater, sending the first tendrils of warmth into the frozen air. "It'll take time to heat the space," Hayes cautioned as Holloway joined him. "But it's something." Holloway nodded, holding his hands toward the stove. The warmth against his frozen fingers was almost painful, blood flow returning to numbed extremities with a vengeance. "We should move Ortega closer once it's properly heated," Hayes agreed, then glanced toward where Grayson sat beside the wounded radio man, his expression distant. "The kid's not doing well," he observed quietly. "Not physically, that's improving, but up here." He tapped his temple. Holloway had noticed the same thing. Since their escape from the German camp, Grayson had retreated deeper into himself, functioning almost automatically. He followed orders and performed necessary tasks, but the spark that had defined him, that youthful idealism and eagerness, had been extinguished. "He's processing his first kill," Holloway said. "It hit some harder than others." Hayes shook his head. "It's more than that. He's convinced we're not getting out of this. I've seen it before. Men who give up mentally, who decide they're already dead and just waiting for their bodies to catch up." Holloway frowned, watching Grayson's vacant stare. Hayes was right. There was a fatalism in the young soldier's demeanor that went beyond normal combat stress or shock from his first killing. "Keep him busy," Holloway decided. "Don't give him time to dwell on it. The moment we start feeling safe, that's when the mind catches up to what the body's been through." Hayes nodded in understanding. "I'll put him to work gathering more fuel for the stove." As the sergeant moved away, Holloway conducted a more thorough assessment of their situation. They had found shelter, a significant advantage. The stove would provide heat, addressing their most immediate threat. They had some rations salvaged from the German truck, enough for perhaps 2 days, if carefully rationed. They had weapons, ammunition, and basic medical supplies. But the challenges remained daunting. Ortega's condition was critical and deteriorating. Grayson was psychologically fragile. All of them suffered from varying degrees of exposure and exhaustion. They were still miles from friendly lines in terrain, made nearly impassable by the storm, and somewhere behind them, German search parties were undoubtedly combing the area, led by a commander intelligent enough to recognize the threat they posed. Holloway moved to a small window, wiping frost from the glass to peer outside. The storm continued unabated, the world beyond the barn a white void. Night was falling, adding darkness to the already limited visibility. In some ways, this worked to their advantage. The Germans would struggle to track them in such conditions. But it also meant another night of dangerously low temperatures, another test of endurance for men already pushed to their limits. As he watched, a flicker of light caught his attention, distant, ephemeral, but unmistakable. A flare rising above, the tree line miles to the west, burning with an eerie red glow against the snow-filled sky. Then another, and another, forming a pattern. "Hayes," he called quietly. "Look at this." The sergeant joined him at the window, squinting into the distance. "Signal flares," he confirmed. "German pattern. They're coordinating search parties." Holloway nodded grimly. "They're methodical, establishing a search grid." "In this weather?" Hayes sounded skeptical. "They'd be risking their own men." "Their commander knows what we've done," Holloway replied. "Those artillery pieces were valuable. He won't let us escape if he can help it." More flares rose in the distance, creating a rough semicircle that appeared to be expanding eastward, in their direction. "How much time do you think we have?" Hayes asked. Holloway considered the distance and conditions. "In this weather? They can't move fast. Maybe 24 hours before they reach this area. But we can't count on that. We need to be ready to move at first light." Hayes glanced toward Ortega. "He won't survive another march in this cold." "I know," Holloway said quietly. The weight of command pressed down on him again, the terrible responsibility of decisions that balanced one life against many. "We'll figure it out in the morning," he finally said. "For now, we focus on regaining strength. Shifts for watching and tending the fire. 4 hours each." Hayes nodded, accepting the temporary reprieve from the impossible decision. "I'll take first watch." Holloway didn't argue, recognizing his own desperate need for rest. He found a relatively clean patch of hay near the stove, wrapped himself in the remaining blanket and lay down. His body screamed with relief at the simple act of horizontal rest after so many hours of pushing beyond human endurance. Despite the relative safety and growing warmth from the stove, sleep proved elusive. His mind raced, cycling through scenarios, calculating odds, weighing options. The flares in the distance haunted him, evidence that their enemy was determined, organized, and closing in. For all their success in destroying the German artillery, they remained in grave danger, trapped between a relentless human enemy and the even more implacable foe of the Arctic storm. The last thing Holloway saw before exhaustion finally claimed him was Grayson's face, illuminated by the stove's glow, young features hardened prematurely by what he'd experienced, eyes that had seen too much, too soon. It was an expression Holloway had seen before, in Normandy, on men who never made it home. He vowed that this time would be different. Somehow, some way, he would get his remaining men back alive. But as sleep overtook him, the red flares continued to rise in the distance, marking the steady approach of an enemy who had made the same vow, to find them, no matter the cost. Dawn broke reluctantly over the Ardennes. The storm had subsided to a steady snowfall with improved visibility. Lieutenant Holloway stood at the barn's frosted window, spotting movement at the tree line. "They're coming," he said as Hayes joined him. German soldiers in white winter gear advanced methodically through the snow. Full platoon at minimum. "So we stand and fight," Hayes stated flatly. "On our terms," Holloway confirmed. They quickly organized their defense. Grayson took the sniper position in the loft, his earlier hesitation replaced by grim determination. Hayes and Holloway rigged explosives around the perimeter, using supplies from the German truck. Ortega, still weak from his wound, was positioned in the most protected corner. "How long can we hold?" Hayes asked. "An hour. Maybe 2," Holloway answered honestly. They were preparing their positions when Ortega called out, "Lieutenant, the radio?" Holloway found the wounded radio man had discovered a damaged German field radio. "I can fix it," Ortega insisted. "Retune it to our frequency." "Do what you can," Holloway agreed, though his hopes weren't high. The first shots rang out as Grayson engaged the approaching Germans from the loft. The battle began with methodical exchanges of fire. The Germans probed their defenses, lost men to well-placed traps and Grayson's accurate shooting, but steadily closed the perimeter. Through his field glasses, Holloway spotted a tall officer directing the German forces, Hauptmann Voss, orchestrating the assault with textbook precision. The Germans suddenly intensified their attack from multiple directions. "They're setting charges," Hayes shouted seconds before an explosion blasted through the barn wall. German soldiers poured through the breach, firing as they came. The battle devolved into chaotic close-quarters combat. Grayson took a bullet in the leg as he attempted to retreat from the loft. Hayes dragged him to safety, fighting with the efficiency of a veteran. Holloway's rifle ran dry, forcing him to switch to his sidearm. They established a defensive position around the wounded Grayson and the still-working Ortega, fighting back-to-back against waves of German soldiers. "Getting a bit sporty, Lieutenant," Hayes remarked with grim humor, blood soaking his sleeve from a shoulder wound. "Just another day at the office, Sergeant," Holloway replied. During a brief lull, Ortega's voice cut through the din. "Lieutenant, Allied frequency, faint but clear. They're sending armor. ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. They needed to hold just 20 more minutes." Holloway sprinted to their final explosive charge, setting it to collapse part of the barn structure. "Fire in the hole!" he shouted as the charge detonated, bringing down the roof onto a cluster of German soldiers. In the chaotic aftermath, Holloway found Hayes lying in a pool of blood, a bayonet wound to his abdomen that had gone unnoticed. In the fighting, "Armor's on the way," Holloway told him. 20 minutes. Hayes gripped his arm weakly. "Don't think I'll be joining that party." His voice faded. "Promise me something. Get these boys home. Ortega, Grayson, they deserve to see home again." "I promise," Holloway said, throat tight. "Hear that?" Hayes whispered. "Tanks, ours. Beautiful sound." His eyes closed, his hand slipped away, and Sergeant William Hayes was gone. The Germans regrouped, but with less coordination. Through the dust and snow, Holloway spotted Voss at the main entrance, calculating his next move. Their eyes met briefly, two commanders, each recognizing the other's determination. The sound of approaching Sherman tanks grew stronger. Voss recognized it too. Holloway watched as the German commander conferred with his officers, weighing options, counting costs. Finally, Voss gave an order. His men began a disciplined withdrawal toward the tree line. "They're pulling back," Grayson said incredulously. "Not retreating," Holloway corrected. "Repositioning." American artillery shells began impacting behind the German positions. Through his field glasses, Holloway spotted the first Sherman cresting a ridge, followed by more. Voss had made his decision, just in time, extracting his remaining force before they were caught in the open. As the first Sherman approached, Holloway slumped against the wall, exhaustion finally overtaking him. They had held. Ortega crawled to Hayes's side. "He knew what he was fighting for," he said quietly. They all did. Through the shattered entrance, Holloway caught a final glimpse of Voss at the forest's edge. The German commander raised his hand, in what might have been a salute before disappearing into the trees. Holloway returned the gesture, a private acknowledgement between adversaries who recognized in each other the burden of command. As American medics rushed into the barn, Holloway remained by Hayes's side. The battle was over. They had completed their mission and survived until rescue arrived. But survival came with its own burdens. He had promised Hayes to get the others home, and he would keep that promise. The storm was finally clearing, weak sunlight occasionally breaking through the clouds. Yet Holloway knew some storms never truly passed. They merely retreated inside the men who had weathered them, becoming part of who they were, shaping every decision that followed. The storm cleared by midday, revealing a stark landscape of blood-stained snow and shattered timber. American soldiers secured the perimeter around the barn, while medics tended to the wounded. Lieutenant James Holloway stood outside, watching silently as they carried Hayes's body to the waiting transport. The sergeant's frozen fingers still clutched his rifle, his face set in what almost looked like peace. Holloway knelt beside the stretcher before they covered Hayes with a blanket. He reached out, gently loosening the sergeant's grip on his Thompson, then placed the weapon alongside the body. "Rest easy, Bill," he murmured, words meant for Hayes alone. "You got us through." He straightened the sergeant's collar in a final gesture of respect, remembering how Hayes had always insisted on proper military bearing, even in the worst conditions. "We made it count." The man who had been the unit's backbone, who had steadied, Grayson with blunt wisdom, who had fought until his last breath, reduced now to another flag-draped figure heading home in a box. Holloway had seen this too many times before, yet it never grew easier. "Sir? They need you at the command vehicle." A young private appeared at Holloway's side, hesitant to disturb his vigil. Holloway nodded but didn't move immediately. His gaze swept across the battlefield, taking in the German bodies half buried in snow, the shell casings that peppered the ground, the collapsed section of barn where his last desperate gambit had worked. 4 men against a platoon, 2 dead, 1 critically wounded, 1 forever changed, and himself, alive, but carrying a weight heavier than any physical burden. He noticed a small object glinting in the snow. Stooping to retrieve it, he found Hayes's lighter, a brass Zippo with a dent along one side, the sergeant's lucky charm since Normandy. Holloway remembered the countless times he'd seen Hayes flick it open, the familiar metallic snap as distinctive as the man himself, sometimes to light a cigarette, sometimes just to fidget with when planning their next move. The lighter had become part of Hayes, an extension of his personality. Holloway pocketed it, a small piece of his friend to carry forward. Then his eyes caught something else, the tattered American flag they had hung from the barn roof. It had been torn down, in the battle, but somehow remained mostly intact, its colors stark against the white snow. He retrieved this too, folding it carefully and tucking it inside his jacket. He finally turned away, following the private to where a major waited beside a Sherman tank, maps spread across its hood. "Lieutenant Holloway, Major Davies, 101st Armored." The officer extended his hand, his expression a mixture of respect and curiosity. "Hell of a job you did here. Intelligence is already calling your mission a crucial success. Those artillery positions you destroyed were set to launch a major offensive against the southern Allied flank. You saved thousands of lives." Holloway shook the offered hand mechanically, the words washing over him without penetrating. Thousands of lives saved. 2 men lost. The brutal arithmetic of war. "My men," he said instead. "Private Ortega and Corporal Grayson." "The radio man's been evacuated to a field hospital," Davies assured him, consulting a clipboard. "Critical but stable. The bullet missed his vital organs, though the blood loss and exposure nearly did him in. Your field treatment probably saved his life." The major flipped a page. "The sniper's getting patched up now. Bullet went clean through the leg, missed the bone. He'll make it." Holloway nodded, relief mingling with exhaustion. He'd kept half his promise to Hayes. "We pulled a German officer for questioning," Davies continued, gesturing toward a field tent where a prisoner was being processed. "Says their commander was some professor turned Captain Voss, apparently quite brilliant. Tactical genius." He studied Holloway with newfound interest. "Claims he's never seen anyone adapt to battlefield conditions like you did. Use the storm as a weapon. That true?" "We did what was necessary," Holloway replied, unwilling to dress survival as heroism. "Well, whatever you did, it worked. We found over 40 German dead, and based on tracks, at least that many wounded were evacuated. 4 men against those odds." Davies shook his head in disbelief. "We're recommending commendations for your entire unit. Silver stars at minimum." Holloway's jaw tightened. Medals, as if bits of metal and ribbon could possibly balance the scales against what they'd lost, what they'd endured. Davies seemed to sense his discomfort. We need a full debrief, but that can wait until we get you back to base. He studied Holloway with the practiced eye of a veteran. When's the last time you slept, Lieutenant? I don't remember, Holloway admitted. That's what I thought. Get yourself on that transport. We'll handle cleanup here. Davies hesitated, then added more quietly. For what it's worth, Lieutenant, men like your sergeant, they're the backbone of this army. I'll make sure his sacrifice is noted properly in my report. His name was William Hayes, Holloway said, his voice firm. He'd been fighting since North Africa. Never once complained, never once faltered. Remember him for that, not just as another casualty statistic. I will, Davies promised, his respect evident. Holloway nodded once, then turned away. He made his way through the bustling activity of the rescue force, soldiers securing the perimeter, medics tending to the wounded, officers coordinating the evacuation. It all seemed strangely distant, as if he were watching a scene unfold from behind glass. His engineering mind cataloged the details of the barn's destruction with clinical precision. Support beams shattered by explosive force, bullet holes, clustered around defensive positions, blood frozen in crimson patterns across snow and wood. The analytical part of his brain couldn't help but calculate angles, forces, probabilities. The physics of violence that had determined who lived, and who died in the chaotic minutes of their last stand. He found Grayson sitting on a crate outside a medical tent, his bandaged legs stretched before him. The young soldier's eyes tracked Holloway's approach, but there was no trace of the eager farm boy who had started this mission. Those eyes had seen too much, done too much, were pulling out, Holloway told him. Ortega's already been evacuated. Grayson nodded. Is he going to make it? They think so. A long silence fell between them, filled with things neither man needed to say. Finally, Grayson spoke. I keep thinking about those Germans I shot, the sentries. His voice was steady, not regretful but reflective. I didn't think I could do it. Then I did. And now you know you can. Holloway finished for him. That's the burden you carry forward. Grayson looked up at him. Hayes told me before the end, that it gets easier. Does it? Holloway considered the question, owing the young soldier the truth. Not easier, different. You learn to live with it. He sat down beside Grayson, feeling the weight of his own experiences. The first one stays with you. I still remember mine. Beach near Oran, North Africa. German machine gunner. Couldn't have been more than 17. Grayson looked surprised at this admission. How do you handle it? You remind yourself why we're here. What would happen if we weren't? Holloway gestured toward the distant horizon, where the faint outlines of the artillery positions they destroyed were just visible. Those guns would have killed hundreds, maybe thousands. Your shot saved lives, Grayson. It's not much comfort in the dark hours, but it's something to hold on to. Grayson absorbed this, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a battered photograph. My family's farm, he explained, offering it to Holloway. The small black and white image showed a modest farmhouse, fields stretching beyond, a family of 5 posed stiffly in their Sunday best. I keep thinking about what Hayes said, about making them remember us. His voice strengthened. I think they will. Yes, Holloway agreed, handing back the photograph. They will. He helped Grayson to his feet, supporting him as they made their way to the waiting transport. A medic was preparing a space among other wounded men being evacuated. How's Ortega really doing? Holloway asked the medic privately. The man's expression was guarded. Touch and go, sir. He's lost a lot of blood, and that wound's showing early signs of infection despite your best efforts. But he's strong, and he's fighting. That counts for a lot. When will you know? If he makes it through the next 24 hours, his chances improve significantly. The field hospital has penicillin, proper surgical facilities. The medic's eyes softened slightly. He was conscious when we loaded him. Asked about you and the others. That's a good sign. Awareness, concern for his unit. Holloway nodded, filing this information away. One more worry, one more wait. He kept saying something about a radio, the medic added. Seemed important to him. It was, Holloway confirmed. He fixed a broken radio under enemy fire, after being shot. Called in our coordinates. Without him, we'd all be dead. The medic's eyebrows rose. I'll make sure the doctors know. Sometimes having a purpose helps pull them through. As Grayson was settled inside the transport, Holloway paused, turning back for one final look at the battlefield. The barn stood, in partial ruin, its ancient timbers having witnessed yet another chapter in humanity's endless capacity for both destruction and resilience. Beyond it, the forest stretched dark and impenetrable, the same trees that had sheltered them now reclaiming their secrets. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, the recon mission turned desperate survival fight, the storm that had been both ally and enemy, the men who had fallen along the way, Wilson, cut down in the initial retreat, Carmichael, lost as they scaled the ridge, Hayes, fighting to his last breath in the final stand. Each death a personal failure in Holloway's mind, each name another weight he would carry home. In the distance, on a ridge overlooking the area, he caught a glimpse of movement, a small group of figures observing the American activity. Through his field glasses, he recognized the tall form of Hauptmann Voss among them. The German commander stood motionless, watching the aftermath of the battle he had nearly won. Even at this distance, Holloway could discern the officer's bearing, straight-backed, composed, observing with the calculated precision of a tactician, rather than the gloating of a victor or the shame of the defeated. Here was a man who understood war's cold equations, who recognized that battles turned on moments, decisions, and sometimes mere chance. As if sensing Holloway's gaze, Voss raised his hand in a deliberate gesture. Not quite a salute, but a clear acknowledgement. Holloway returned it, a private exchange between adversaries who understood each other better than most allies ever could. Then Voss turned and disappeared into the tree line, taking his remaining men with him. Holloway wondered briefly if they would meet again in the theater of war, two commanders bound by a strange respect forged in blood and snow. Or perhaps their paths had crossed just this once, a random intersection in the vast chaos of conflict, never to be repeated. Fresh snow began to fall, light flurries dancing on the strengthening wind. Nature was already reclaiming the battlefield, covering shell holes, softening the harsh edges of destruction, burying the dead under a pristine white shroud. By tomorrow, little evidence would remain of the desperate struggle that had played out here. Just another anonymous chapter in the vast tragedy of the war. Holloway found himself thinking of the massive 80mm artillery pieces they had destroyed. Products of human ingenuity, engineering marvels in their way, designed for the sole purpose of dealing death at great distances. As an engineer, he could appreciate their technical excellence while despising their purpose. The same creativity that could build bridges, homes, vehicles for peace, turned instead to ever more efficient methods of destruction. A young medic approached, offering Holloway a steaming cup. "Coffee, sir. You look like you could use it." Holloway accepted the cup, the warmth seeping into his frozen fingers. "Thanks. The major says we're moving out in 10 minutes. The medic hesitated, his expression revealing a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "I heard what you and your men did. Holding off a German platoon, it's remarkable." Holloway didn't respond. The word remarkable seemed obscene in the context of Hayes's body lying in the transport, of Wilson and Carmichael left behind in shallow graves, of Ortega fighting for his life, of the innocence forever stripped from Grayson's eyes. "I enlisted after Pearl Harbor," the medic continued, misinterpreting Holloway's silence as invitation. "Thought I'd be patching up heroes and seeing history made. Instead," he gestured at the carnage around them, the words trailing off. "Instead, you learned that war is just men killing each other in increasingly efficient ways," Holloway finished for him, his voice devoid of judgment. "While other men try to piece them back together." The medic looked at him gratefully. "Yes, sir, exactly that." He paused, then added more quietly, "Sometimes I wonder if anyone back home really understands what it's like out here." They can't, Holloway replied simply. And maybe it's better that way. He sipped the coffee, barely tasting it, watching as the snow began to erase their footprints. The storm that had been both their salvation and torment had passed, but Holloway knew its effects would linger forever, in nightmares and phantom pains, in the way they would flinch at sudden sounds or stare into middle distance at memories only they could see. He thought of Normandy again, of the 9 men he'd lost there. Their faces came to him now with startling clarity. Simmons with his perpetual smile, Rodriguez and his harmonica, Cooper who kept a picture of his sweetheart tucked in his helmet. He'd carried their deaths as a personal failure, a weight that never quite lifted. Now Hayes, Wilson, and Carmichael would join them, more ghosts to walk beside him in the quiet moments. "You think it was worth it, sir?" the medic asked suddenly. "What you did here?" Holloway considered the question. "Ask me again when we win this war," he finally said. "Right now, I'm too close to see anything but what it cost." The medic nodded, as if this made perfect sense, then moved on to tend to other wounded. In the distance, an officer called the final order to move out. Holloway took one last look at the battlefield, committing it to memory. Not the clean, white expanse it was, rapidly becoming, but the bloody, desperate reality of what had happened here. This was the truth of war, not the sanitized version that would appear in reports or be told in comfortable living rooms back home. He thought of the letters he would have to write, to Hayes's wife in Philadelphia, to Wilson's parents in Oregon, to Carmichael's fiancée in Georgia. What could he possibly say to convey both honor for their sacrifice and the brutal truth of their final moments? The standard phrases seemed hollow, insufficient. Your husband died heroically. Your son's sacrifice was not in vain. Your fiancé's courage will not be forgotten. True, perhaps, but sanitized, stripped of the mud and blood and terror that had actually accompanied their deaths. He would write the letters anyway because it was his duty, but the gap between what he would say and what had actually happened would remain unbridgeable. He climbed into the transport beside Grayson, nodding to the driver. The young corporal had fallen into an exhausted sleep, his face momentarily peaceful, as if his mind had granted him temporary reprieve from the horrors he had witnessed and participated in. Holloway envied him that small mercy. His own mind remained relentlessly active, replaying decisions, calculating alternatives, cataloging errors. What if they had taken a different route? What if he had spotted the German sentries sooner? What if they had waited for reinforcements instead of using the storm to infiltrate? 1,000 branching possibilities, each leading to different outcomes, different casualties. The futility of such thinking wasn't lost on him, yet he couldn't stop. It was both the blessing and curse of his engineering mind, the ability to see problems from all angles, but also the inability to accept that some variables remained forever outside his control. As the vehicle lurched forward, beginning the long journey back to the Allied lines, Holloway felt Hayes's lighter in his pocket. He pulled it out, running his thumb over the worn brass, the flame wheel that had lit countless cigarettes through 3 years of war. The dent along the side was from a piece of German shrapnel at El Alamein, Hayes had once told him. Lucky dent, the sergeant had called it, claiming the same fragment would have taken his head off if not for a timely duck. Holloway flicked it open, and despite the snow and wind, it ignited on the first try. Just as reliable as the man who had carried it, the small flame danced defiantly against the growing darkness, a tiny point of warmth in the vast cold landscape. He thought of Hayes's final request. Get these boys home. 2 out of 4 wasn't victory, but in war, sometimes it was the best you could hope for. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes, feeling the weight of command, of survival, of memory. A sergeant from the rescue unit glanced at him. You all right, Lieutenant? I will be, Holloway answered, though he wasn't certain it was true. The transport rumbled on, leaving behind the ruins of the barn and the forest that had nearly claimed their lives. Ahead lay the Allied lines, field hospitals, debriefings, and eventually, for the lucky ones, home. Home. The concept seemed almost abstract now, What even constituted home after what they'd seen, what they'd done? Could any of them truly go back to what they had been before? Holloway doubted it. The war had marked them, changed them in ways that civilian life could never fully accommodate. Grayson would never again be the eager farm boy who enlisted to escape a life of plowing fields. Ortega, if he survived, would carry both physical and mental scars of their ordeal, and Holloway himself. He looked down at his hands, dirty, cracked, from cold, stained with traces of blood, his own and others, that never seemed to fully wash away. These hands had built bridges before the war. Would they ever build again? Or would they forever remain instruments of destruction, trained now for a purpose their owner never intended? The tattered American flag he had retrieved from the barn still rested inside his jacket. He could feel it there, a reminder of what they had fought for, though the ideal and the reality often seemed worlds apart. They had defended the flag, yes, but more immediately they had fought for each other, for survival, for the simple human instinct to see another dawn. Holloway knew the Ardennes would never truly leave them. The forest's dark silhouette would remain etched in their memories, as would the brutal cold, the desperation, the moments when death seemed not just possible but certain. The storm had passed, but some storms never truly end. They become part of you, shaping everything that follows. Holloway knew he would carry this one for the rest of his life, as would Grayson, as would Ortega if he survived. As would Voss on the other side of a conflict that made enemies of men who, in another life, might have respected each other as colleagues or friends. He wondered what he would tell people, after the war, if they asked about his service. What sanitized version would he offer to spare them the details too grotesque, too intimate to share? Would he speak of heroism and duty, of clear moral purpose? Or would he tell them the truth, that war stripped men to their essence, revealing both the heights of courage and the depths of brutality that existed in each soul? Probably neither. Those who hadn't been there couldn't understand, and those who had didn't need explanations. The transport rumbled on, carrying them away from the Ardennes, away from the artillery position they had destroyed, away from the men they had lost. But not away from the storm within, the one that would continue long after the snow melted and the war itself faded into history. That storm, Holloway knew, would remain forever. When he closed his eyes, he could still see Hayes's face in the final moments, could still hear the sergeant's voice over the howling wind. Some storms you weather, Lieutenant. Others become a part of you. Hayes had said that during their second night in the field, as the Arctic front descended upon them. Holloway hadn't fully understood then. Now he did. The war would go on. There would be more battles, more strategies, more deaths, more letters to write to grieving families, more medals awarded for actions no one who hadn't been there could truly comprehend. More young men changed forever by the crucible of combat. But this storm, these men, this mission, this impossible stand against overwhelming odds, would stay, with him always, a private winter he would carry within no matter what season the world moved into next. As the transport crested a hill, Holloway opened his eyes and looked back one last time. The battlefield had nearly disappeared from view, the ruined barn now just a dark speck against white wilderness. Fresh snow continued to fall, nature's indifferent hand drawing a veil over humanity's latest exercise in violence. By tomorrow, there would be little evidence that 6 American soldiers had fought and died there, that a German battalion had suffered a crucial setback, that men on both sides had endured the dual assault of weather and war. The reports would be filed, the medals awarded, the dead buried beneath markers neat and standardized. The war would move on to other forests, other villages, other strategic positions deemed essential to hold or take. But Holloway would remember. Not the sanitized version that would appear in official accounts, but the truth, the fear, the cold, the desperation, the moments of clarity and confusion, the smell of blood freezing on snow, Hayes's final words, Grayson's transformation, Ortega's stubborn refusal to surrender to death. These were the truths of war, the ones that never made it into history books or newsreels, the ones carried silently by the men who survived, buried with those who didn't. Holloway tightened his grip on Hayes's lighter, a tangible link to a man who had given everything to ensure others might live. Not a hero from a propaganda poster, but something far more valuable. A good soldier, a loyal friend, a human being who had faced the worst of war without surrendering his humanity. "I'll get them home, Bill," he whispered, a final promise to his fallen sergeant. "Then I'll make sure they remember what you did here, what you all did." The transport disappeared over the hill, leaving the battlefield behind. The storm had passed, but its echoes would resonate forever, carried in the hearts and minds of those who had weathered its fury and emerged, changed, wounded, but alive, on the other side. To lost, but not away from the storm within, the one that would continue long after the snow melted and the war itself faded into history. That storm, Holloway knew, would remain forever. When he closed his eyes, he could still see Hayes's face. In the final moments, could still hear the sergeant's voice over the howling wind. "Some storms you weather, Lieutenant. Others become a part of you." Hayes had said that during their second night in the field, as the Arctic front descended upon them. Holloway hadn't fully understood then. Now he did. The war would go on. There would be more battles, more strategies, more deaths. But this storm, these men, this mission, this impossible stand against overwhelming odds, would stay with him always, a private winter he would carry within, no matter what season the world moved into next. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.